You are listening to the new man beyond the macho jerk and the new age wimp. Your host is men's coach Tripp Lanier.
Do you think some folks are just magically able to bounce back from adversity? Or did they just practice something you could learn too? Do you think other people are successful because they figured out a way to avoid problems? And what can you do the next time life serves up an unexpected challenge? Ryan Holiday is here to discuss how you can turn adversity into advantage and why the obstacle is the way. Welcome to The New Man. Today we're talking with Ryan Holiday. He's the author of the bestseller, Trust Me, I'm Lying. And today we're going to discuss his latest, The Obstacle is the Way, the timeless art of turning adversity to advantage. Ryan, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tripp.
I think this book should be called How to Be a Badass.
Well, yeah, I wanted it to be about some of the badasses of history and how they overcame their problems, because I think, we all have problems, we all have obstacles, and I wanted to show, that they can be overcome.
Well, I think that's a good point, because a lot of guys that I talk to, they're chasing some kind of fantasy. They're living in this world that like, oh, well, if I was living my passion or if I was living my purpose, well, that would mean I would be on easy street, that things would be fun. And if I'm experiencing some kind of a challenge, then it means that I must be doing something wrong. I must not be doing the right thing with my life. And so a lot of these guys just disengage. They get into analysis paralysis. They're sitting on the sidelines, like waiting for the right thing to come along. And then another trap that I see is this belief of exoneration. Phil Stutz was on the show, and we talked about exoneration. Like there's this velvet rope or this finish line. Once I get there, I'm going to have enough money on the status, validation, security, whatever. But then I'll be fine. I'll be removed from this adversity that's happening here. And I've found that just creates a lot of suffering. This like, oh, I'm missing out on something. There's FOMO happening. And if I'm not there, then I must be doing something wrong. So how do the ideas in this book make a difference to the average guy who might be thinking that if there's some kind of adversity in his life, he's getting it wrong?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think a big part of the problem is that people forget that obstacles are supposed to happen, right? That this is sort of part of how it's supposed to go. Like the path is not easy, and in fact, because it's hard, is where the opportunities come from. That's why the title of the book is "The Obstacle is the Way." What I'm showing in the book is how sort of people who you thought were very successful, actually, if you sort of backtrack to where they were before they were successful, there was some sort of problem or impediment that happened to them, because bad things happen to everyone. And we don't choose that happens, but we choose how we respond. And so Stoicism, which is the philosophy that this book is based on, is about accepting, one, that you don't control the world, and two, that you only control yourself. And so if you're going to control if you're going to sort of concentrate everything onto that reaction, that gives you a lot more power and a lot more flexibility. And what the Stoics believed was that everything that does happen is a chance for you to behave virtuously. So it's like, some girl rejects you. Well, that's a chance for you to examine why you wanted this person's sort of approval or acknowledgement so badly. It's a chance for you to look at what you did wrong, that you learn or you benefit from that failure. Or if you're successful, conversely, it's a chance for you to examine why that success was so important to you, and to poke holes in it and to look at why perhaps that wasn't a panacea either. So what I quote Marcus Aurelius at the opening of the book, and he says, like, look, our actions can be impeded, but our responses never can. And so this is a whole book about a set of responses to negative or seemingly unfortunate situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so we can, shit happens basically, and then we can choose our response. We can collapse to it, or we can say, okay, what's the opportunity here? But before we get into that, what do you see happening from your perspective? How are most people trained or, kind of, in this mindset to respond to adversity? What's the status quo?
Yeah, look, I think the status quo has a couple problems. One is which we assume things are supposed to be a certain way. Like our world is supposed to be exactly as our parents was. So like, getting a good degree should mean you get a good job. Or, you put your money in these investments that should guarantee you a retirement at this age. And then, a lot of things have happened, and now we're starting to realize like, hey, maybe one or two generations was not a long enough timeline to project an indefinite future of the same thing. And so we exist in a much more chaotic, um, unfortunate environment, and we're having to sort of make do with that. And I specifically see this with millennials. There's a sense of sort of entitlement that you made all these plans and now the world is not agreeing with those plans, and now you're justified in being upset or pissed off about that.
That's that collapsed way of looking at the world. It's supposed to be a certain way. It's not boo-hoo me. Now I don't do anything, or I just kind of sit here and just bitch and moan.
Right. You use the word paralyzed. I think we often get paralyzed in front of our obstacles because not only are they not how we expected, now we sort of wait for this perfect opportunity, or this perfect solution to the problem, rather than like getting started and understanding that it's going to be a long, hard slog to turn things around. But if we work at it, it will happen. So it's not only that something's not the way it's supposed to be. Now we're in pursuit of some perfect, even trade, when really, if we just accepted it for what it was and got to work, we'd already be much further along the path by now.
So it's that belief that things are supposed to be perfect. It's the belief that things are supposed to be a different way that actually is really fueling the paralysis, instead of like, well, this is how things are. Now what am I going to do?
Yeah, exactly. And look, we used to. It's. I don't want to glamorize the past, because that's not accurate or true either. But I think we forget that people used to live in a world that was much less controllable, right? We couldn't predict the weather. There wasn't this social safety net. People could die at any moment from unknown diseases and ailments and accidents. And so I think people used to have a sense that, like, look, the world is a capricious and random place. I've got to get my stuff together and prepare myself best I can, and do the most that I can in this little window. Now I think we tend to assume that we've got this unlimited runway, we've got unlimited resources, and that everyone is looking out for us. And then when that turns out not to be true, it's a very rude and unpleasant awakening.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, where did this shit take hold? Because I'm just thinking, like,
yeah,
what's your guess on that? How did this come about? Because my
Sure.
grandparents didn't live in that world, and neither did my
Right.
parents. So where did this idea take such a damned hold on things?
I think it's a gradual. It's a gradual process that happened in parallel to technological and economic and cultural advancements. Things have gotten fairer. They've gotten safer. They've gotten easier. And we forget, though, that, like, just because we can predict the weather doesn't mean we control it. Just because we have insurance doesn't mean that bad things won't ever happen to us. Like, I'll give you an example. So recently my house got broken into, and like everything I owned was stolen, and I had insurance, right? So it was good. But like, I remember thinking it was like, I was like mad at the insurance company about it, like that they weren't like acting fast enough and they weren't doing everything that I wanted. And then it just hit me. It's like, my stuff got stolen. This is a crappy situation. I can't, like, there's no one who's just going to make this right for me. I have to accept that unfortunate things happen in the world. And I should focus instead, the obstacle is the way. I should focus instead on, why did I have my house set up in a way that this could happen? And two, why have I created these attachments to these material items that I'm apparently so sensitive and emotional about, that if anything happens to them, I freak out.
That's a huge shift there. We've gone from a victim mentality where, everything is out there. The reason why my world sucks is because of those things, those people, this breakdown in the system, and you completely flipped it. All right, I'm completely responsible here. So what can I learn from that? I've set my house up a certain way. I've set my beliefs up a certain way. That's why I feel like shit right now.
Yeah, and I think people are actually pretty good at doing that in certain parts of their life. Like for instance, like if you knew someone in your life that got really angry at like traffic lights and construction and everything else, you judge them insane, right? Because you're like, look, the traffic light tells you you can't go, you gotta wait, you're gonna be late, deal with it. But then in the rest of our lives, like, you're working on your business and something happens, or, you have an employee and they turn out not to be capable of what you hired them to do. We take it all personally and we get so upset instead of looking at the parts of that we do control and that we can influence. And we end up wasting immense amounts of energy and willpower and goodwill getting upset and getting emotional and getting frustrated, when really, if we could be more fluid and accommodating, we would not only be happier, but we'd be much more effective.
Yeah. Well, I think we can come back to this point of like, as long as we're complaining, we're bitching, we're looking where we can point fingers, we're not actually looking at a solution, or we're not taking responsibility. But there's something in there, because
Sure.
is there a shadow to this? Is there a shadow to stoicism? That, because I work with a lot of guys that have been stuffing their emotions for
Sure.
years. These guys are shells of a man, and
I know
so
exactly what you're saying.
and I've lived that way, and it's miserable. So how do we transcend and include? How do we integrate this approach so he's not
Sure.
collapsed and paralyzed, but he's also not some robotic shell of a man?
Well, I think it's two things. So one, what the Stoics are saying is understand the difference between an emotional reaction and a rational reaction. So if something like my stuff got broken into, I got in a car accident, it's okay to get upset. It's okay to be hurt. It's okay maybe to cry if that's how you feel. Just don't confuse those reactions with doing anything about the problem, right? Like, as long as you can understand, it's like, look, this is my moment. I'm going to freak out and then I'm going to deal with it. That's fine.
I'm going to choose my action from a place of rational mindset instead of this kind of ungrounded emotional place.
Right. It's like I deal with so many people who it's like they come to me with a problem. They tell me how upset about it they are and all this stuff, and they've been thinking about it and whatever. And then I talk to them like 2 months later, and it's still in the same place because they haven't done anything about it. They just thought more about it. Or
they've probably been processing.
They've
been processing it emotionally,
Yeah,
but they
exactly.
haven't been getting into the trenches and doing anything different.
Exactly. So I think that's the first part. But when you read Stoicism, I and you might see this in the book, it might feel very sometimes robotic, or it might be devoid of emotion, or it might be very like just down to business. But the reason for that is Stoicism is it's a very different than most philosophies, but it's a set of exercises that are designed to combat destructive impulses, assuming that most people are pretty decent at the other ones. Like Stoicism isn't a bunch of guidelines reminding you why you should love your children, or you should, love like the taste of sugar or wine, or all the things that make life fun and nice, right? Like why we laugh at jokes is not something that you needed the Emperor Marcus Aurelius to give you some good reminders about, right? Like that's kind of obvious. But what you do need is a response and a set of tools for dealing with the inevitable problems that come with life, so you're balanced and you're able to address them and do something about them, so you can go back to feeling happy and good. And yes, Stoicism, I think, Stoicism is about keeping an even keel, and so that means balance on both sides. But I think as a rule, and some of the things we were talking about earlier show, like, people tend to be really good at the fun stuff, and then the bad stuff they stick their head in the sand about, or pretend is never going to happen to them, or that they're the exception to. And then when it does happen, as it always does, they are utterly unequipped to deal with it.
Got it. So what's the 30,000-foot view of the process to turn adversity to advantage? Because all of this is between the ears, right? So this is a mindset. So kind of give us the high level view of how to step in that direction.
I opened the book with Marcus Aurelius, who I think is one of the most interesting historical figures of all time. He's the most powerful man in the world, literally a god on earth. And yet this concept of stoicism was what made him effective and peaceful and a surprisingly good person. And then the book is split in three parts from there, which I think are the three critical variables. You have perception, and then I have stories that illustrate perception. And I talk about everyone from Thomas Edison to Ulysses S. Grant, to John D. Rockefeller, to Steve Jobs. And it's about how controlling our emotions, controlling our perspectives, living in the present moment, make it much easier to tackle obstacles. And then the second part is about our actions. How do we act creatively and effectively to address our problems? And there I have, some of my favorite stories. Remember one from, Amelia Earhart to President Andrew Garfield, to Erwin Rommel, Thomas Edison again. And then lastly, there's Barack Obama is actually in there, which is a story I'm really happy with. Gandhi. And then the last part is our sort of will, this strength and power we bring to stuff. And I've got, Odysseus is one of my favorite examples. We've got, I'm pulling these up here. We've got Thomas Jefferson, stories about people who overcame President Lincoln. We've got stories of people who faced sort of insurmountable problems and they had to adapt to them and endure them. And it was that strong inner strength that made it possible. So it's really a three-step process. And that process begins with how you look at the problem. Then it moves on to how you act on that problem. And then it ends with the amount of fortitude and will that you bring to bear on that problem. And I think just about any obstacle or just about any issue is made better by these three things working in concert with each other.
Can this stuff be learned, or is it just something that people are born with? It seems like we look at some of these figures that you're talking about, and it's like, well, of course they're extraordinary. They were born with something. They were born different. But is there, in your research, did you find that they were finding these ideas, or did they just kind of absorb them from somewhere magically? How did they become resilient, or how did they learn how to turn adversity into advantage?
Sure. Look, I think the reason I wrote this book is that I noticed the same pattern that you noticed, that these great men and women of history who had something in common, and they had a specific kind of approach to problems that we all face. And I found explicitly a lot of times that thread was Stoicism. They literally studied Roman Stoicism. But even when they didn't, I think what they did was they did a quick ROI calculation, and they noticed that when they tried to spend their time and energy on things they don't control or change, whether that's other people's approval or external events or, the world around them, they didn't get very far. But when they focused on themselves and on their reactions and what they did control, that's where they got, that's where they had real breakthroughs and where they really made a difference. And, I think independently, lots of groups have studied this, everything from, 12-step groups where they've got the serenity prayer, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think these people discovered that wisdom, but I think the good news is they didn't come out of the womb discovering it. Like I say at the end of the book, Margaret Thatcher wasn't known as the Iron Lady until well late in her life. Ulysses S. Grant was basically a total loser until the Civil War and kind of became one again after, right? Like it's really about what you do at this moment right now. You have a choice. The world is testing you, and how are you going to respond? And I think, I tried to provide some framework. This isn't my thinking. I was trying to communicate this sort of timeless framework that I've observed and that I try to follow myself. And I'm not perfect at it by any means, and I would never say otherwise. But we all have a choice when something happens to us. We have the choice to control our perceptions. We have the choice to direct our actions properly. And then we have we control our own willpower that we bring to something. And that's what I think all these people did. Sometimes, I'm using their stories about what they did at a particular moment. Some of the people in the book were really bad people if you look at it at the aggregate, but there was specific moments or glimpses of greatness that we can learn from and benefit from and try to apply in our own lives.
I know. I'm just, as you said that, I was thinking of, I've gotten hooked on that show House of Cards, and that lead character, Frank Underwood. he's totally, this is his thing. Like any kind of that shit that hits the fan, he uses it. Like he embraces it.
Yep.
And I mean, he's an asshole. You know, he's a bad dude, but he knows how to. Okay, I never see him kind of moping around. He's just like, okay, this event's happened. Now, what am I going to do? How am I going to use this to create a better scenario for myself and what I want?
Yeah, and yeah, again, you don't want to say like you should be like Frank Underwood, but at the same time, you notice there's only one moment in the second season where you ever actually see him like get rattled, right? I think what a lot of these people have in common is they never get rattled, even when the shit like really hits the fan. Like they don't get rattled. They look at it rationally. They apply their energy and effort, usually in some sort of counterintuitive or unexpected way. And that's where they separate themselves from everyone else. Everyone else is running around, they're losing their heads or their shirts or whatever. But they're able to see through all that or past it and look at the unignored or the ignored opportunity. And I think, you know, this goes to all the things that you talk about is like, don't do what everyone else is doing, whether it's, you know, how you're doing with self-improvement, how you're trying to meet, you know, men or women, or how you're trying to manage your business or your lifestyle, is like, look at what everyone else is doing, look at the problems that it causes them, and then why don't we try some different path?
Got it. Well, I can imagine if I'm listening to this, we've been talking about some fictional characters, we've been talking about historical characters. My bullshit meter could start to be going off. So I'm wondering if you've got any stories or just a story. You shared a little bit about your house getting broken into, but what does this look like in just Joe Blow's life, where, you know, how he's handling this instead of when he's in battle or, you know, dealing with somebody trying to take his part of his empire on the other side of the planet.
Right, of course. And I think the reason I chose these stories is that they're sort of universal and timeless, and we can see more clearly in these sort of larger scale issues like the differences between the approaches. It's like when you're talking about straight business, people go like, well, what about this? Or, but I have this problem or I have that problem. And I wanted to sort of not allow for any of those objections. But like, look, in my own life, like I have to think about this on a day-to-day basis. So it's like, you know, you have an employee and they mess something up and they blow, like I had an employee last week who made a mistake on an email I sent out that cost me a few $1,000s. And now I have a choice, right? I can fire this employee because he made a mistake that I don't want to tolerate, and that's something I've got to consider. I can freak out and get angry and let him know how powerful and mean I am or whatever, which might feel good. Or I can say like, look, you made this mistake. Here's why I think you did it. Here's why it matters. And here's now an opportunity for me to make it crystal clear to you why we have to be careful about things and why there are consequences when we are not. And ideally, that turns that employee into a better employee. So it's like how I would want to think about it is, I just paid $2,000 to make this employee better. And if I do it right, I will make more money because of that than I would have if I just berated this person and it was cathartic, but it didn't move it any further. Or, you know, and I think we all have moments like that. I'm in a different thing. I'm having, you know, a dispute with a business partner. It's forcing me to articulate and explain and confront things that maybe if I had my choice, I wouldn't do, but I know I benefit from and I will use again in other situations. And so that's how I try to think about it in my business life, in my personal life, in my relationships, you know.
Well, it's really demonstrating true strength, because I could imagine if I was in that situation and I didn't feel strong, I would need to prove that I was strong, that I wasn't weak. And that's what most guys are really afraid of, is appearing weak to the rest. And so they've got to present this thing of power and toughness, and I don't take any shit. And so you would have fired the guy and berated him and make him feel like an asshole or whatever. But the real strength there is, okay, what's the opportunity here to forgive and then move forward, see something happen there. I just see a lot of guys that get tripped up in that idea of, I can't appear to be weak, but that's actually a form of weakness.
Totally. And I think that manifests itself in a lot of ways, right? Someone disrespects you, or someone treats you crappy, or they underestimate you. Like, these are things where you wanna like get up in their face and explain to them why they shouldn't do that. instead of going like, look, why do I feel that I need this person's validation? This person, like Marcus Aurelius says this in the Meditations, it's great. It's like, look at the people whose respect you seem to be so caught up in having, and ask yourself why. And his point is like, look, you don't respect these people because of how they are and how they act. And yet, if they don't give you their approval, you suddenly feel like you've been denied something. And so that's something I think a lot about too, is like the things that I want to get mad about or I want to react emotionally about, so often they're actually an opportunity for me to re-examine why I'm feeling those emotions and how I can address them in a more positive way instead of like a knee-jerk reaction that ultimately makes things harder for me. Like I had a meeting last night and someone was late, and I wanted to storm off. And you know, if it had been egregiously late, I might have done that. But I had to sit there and ask myself, what would I be doing at home? I'd just be sitting around. Like, give this person, you don't know what's happening to them. Give them a little time. Deal with something in your own life while you have this moment, and things will be fine. You don't need to, you know, put your dick out on the table and prove that it's bigger because you walked off and you didn't allow them to, you know, an extra 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes down to a perception. Am I perceiving a threat in a place where there isn't a threat? You know, and if I'm coming from a small place, a fear-based place, or a low self-esteem place, I'm going to perceive threats everywhere. Like the world is a scary place from that play. You know, talking about this whole thing and perceiving threats. You know, my mom, she took her own life when I was 13. I didn't deal with that for years. I didn't even know what to do. But I was running away from that pain. It became to where I could not deal with it. I think I was in my mid-20s, mid to late 20s when finally, like, I just had to turn around and go right into it. I didn't really have much of a choice. But at the time, it felt like death. Like, it felt like, I couldn't go into that place. It was the place I was struggling and trying to avoid. And so when I saw this title, The Obstacle is the Way, I was like, fuck, that's been my life. Like, that became... That whole situation where I finally went into that place that I was so afraid to go has become where I found the greatest power in my life. Like, once I went through that and I not just survived it, it made me stronger. I was like, well, shit. You know, I don't really enjoy getting emotional or having really bad feelings, but there's a part of me that knows, like, hey, you've been through worse. You've had this. Right. There's this kind of foundational place there. And so as you talk about these ideas, I'm taken back to that place, and I'm like, oh yeah, that thing that I was avoiding for so long was actually become a source of strength here. And you know, I deliberately didn't talk about my own problems in the book because, like, I would never want to make an example out of them, because everyone has their own experiences and we all go through our own traumas. And what you went through was terrible, and no one should have to go through that. But I think it's really interesting that when we reflect on our own lives and we look at the things that we went through that we desperately wanted to avoid when they happened, we find some sort of kernel of benefit from them. It doesn't always make up for the terrible thing that happened to us, but we know that we benefited from it in some way. And I think we would be better off, instead of spending that period of time in limbo where we're angry and we're hurt and we're upset and we're only focused on the bad, and then begrudgingly getting the value or lesson from it far down the road, we can look to speed up that process, and we can find some comfort in it in the moment. Like, there's a study I referenced in the book about elite athletes who go through, like, very terrible injuries, and at the time of the terrible injury, they all think, you know, the world is going to end. Like, they feel terrible about their talent and their skill. And like a year and a half later, when the injury is healed, they're almost always in a better place than they were before. And I think we can take some comfort in that too. So it's like, you know, what you went through was awful, but the next time that something bad happens for you, I imagine you'll take some comfort in the fact that terrible things have already happened and you know where they got you. And so you don't need to assume the world is going to end. Well, I think you've been through it before. Yeah, and that's a powerful place, because a lot of times we're having our experience in the moment, but we're also creating this story. Oh no, now my world is this. And I think what we're talking about here is, have the experience. Like, it sucks. Like, if you need to lose it, lose it. If you need to, have that emotional experience, but watch out for the story you tell. Watch out for the story that says, I'm now this way, I'm broken, my life is broken, I'm fucked, and da-da-da-da-da. That's only true if you really believe it. And so I think it's how do we walk forward, have that emotional experience, but then start to see, okay, at some point, this is going to be an opportunity. At some point, maybe not right now, but at some point, this is going to lead to something a possibility I can't even imagine at this point.
And that's what the Stoics mean when they say there's no good or bad, there's only perception. Like, there's objective events. There's no question that, your knee got blown out, or, you got fired, or you got dumped, or, you were born with this disability or this problem. That is an objective event. But we decide what that story is going to be. And no one's saying it's going to be a fairy tale either, and that's probably not a good approach. But it can be the narrative can have a redemption at the end, and that choice is yours. And I wanted to write a book about how to make that choice a little bit easier. And I don't think it's something you read one time and then it's magically the case. It's something that you talk about in a show a lot. It's like you got to work on constantly, and you always have to be thinking about and practicing and taking the incremental improvements as they come. And hopefully, as you get older, you get better and better at it.
Got it. It's a practice. So, well, other than definitely pick up this book, guys, but what's one thing that the guy could do today that would actually make a difference if he's stuck in traffic or he blows his knee out or, God forbid, anything worse happens? Like, what could he start to do today that would help him out in this area?
Yeah, I think we start with what we started to talk about. We start with perception and the difference between perception and impressions. And so taking things as in their objective first impression, this happened to me, and then taking a breath and a beat before you interpret what it means. Or maybe you don't interpret what it means at all. You just let it exist, and then you develop a rational response to it. So I think controlling our perceptions and our emotions, and not, at the very least, like, no one's going to magically be able to turn an obstacle into an opportunity tomorrow, I don't think.
No.
But can we stop making things worse with irrational responses or, overly emotional responses or reactions or whatever? Then we've stopped the digging, so now we can climb out of the hole.
That's great. I always think of the guy that's in an argument with his girlfriend, and it would have been cool if he just kind of stuck to the plan of the thing, but he said something stupid, and now he's got to spend an extra 2 hours cleaning up the thing that he said that was stupid. So, right. that helps me kind of, stick to that rational, okay, this is happening, this is tough, and choose wisely, choose your response wisely. The Obstacle is the Way, The Timeless Art of Turning Adversity to Advantage. It's available on Amazon. You can check out more about Ryan at ryanholiday.net. Ryan, thanks so much for talking today.
Thanks for having me, man. This is great.
If these interviews are helping you, then please visit The New Man on iTunes and leave us a positive review so others can discover the show more easily. Thanks for listening.